Hi, merry meet. So first let me say this is my 150th video, so yay, that's a lot of monologuing in front of a camera. So topic I wanted to discuss was something that I found on Llewellyn's pages, and that topic was basically when is a tarot deck not a tarot deck, as in what changes can you make to a tarot deck and still have it be tarot. I mean, I've seen decks that are 50 cards that are presented as tarot, and I've seen those that are 150 cards that are still presented as tarot. And some decks have almost no resemblance to what I would call a tarot deck. They have all sorts of cards in them, and they change the suites, they change the arcanas, they change everything. So, yeah. Now, for me, I think it's very hard to set up hard and fast. This is the line. Anything that doesn't have this, and this is not a tarot deck. Now, before I go on, let me also say that I'm not here saying that divination decks that are not tarot are inferior. It's not like, oh, it's not good enough to be tarot. No. I'm just saying that basically, can you categorize it as a tarot deck? Because I use a lot of divination decks, various forms of oracle cards. But when does it go from being tarot to being an oracle card? And that doesn't have anything to do with good or not. It has to do with, does it fit the definition tarot? Well, some said, but it has to have the typical 78 cards. And I can't say I agree, because take the Toast Tarot by Crowley. It has some extra cards, it changes a few things around. The symbolism is still very typical tarot. I wouldn't bat an eye to call that a tarot deck. And there are decks that have the typical 78 cards that have very strange interpretation of them, which makes them less tarot decks than the top tarot who have some extra cards. But yeah, I see that one. But also remember that the first tarot decks that existed in the 14 and 1500s, they didn't have all the cards that we have now. And some of the typical cards have been changed around a lot as the decks have developed. So the original tarot decks did not have 78 cards. That's a much newer invention. And on that same note, I saw a lot of people say that, oh, for it to be a tarot deck, it has to be based on the Rider-Waite deck. Yeah. Why? That's like saying Rider-Waite invented tarot. Or, well, that deck invented it, of course. You have I White, who made the deck, and yeah, then you have the publishing company. But anyway, when that White did not invent the tarot deck, he published a deck that became very popular, and which has to a certain degree become the standard for how tarot decks should be made today. Excuse me. So yeah, what happened was that White was a member of the Golden Dawn, and he wanted to publish a deck because the Golden Dawn used tarot deck, but he didn't want to publish one that spoke of Golden Dawn secrets to outsiders. So he made a deck sort of based on the Golden Dawn one, but still removed enough that people wouldn't guess at what lay behind it. And something that the leadership in the Golden Dawn could approve of. That became the Rider-Waite deck, and it was published in 1909, if I'm not completely mistaken. And the tarot decks go back to the 14 and 1500s. So yeah, now granted, the first use of the tarot deck were for playing card games. It's a card game called Tarocchi that those who could afford to have such decks made played it, basically rich merchants, nobility, and so on. But we have found indications that as far back as 1540, tarot was used as divination. That is quite a few hundred years between tarot first being used for divination and the Rider-Waite deck being published. So to say that the Rider-Waite deck is the by-all and all of definition of what is tarot is idiotic. Sorry, I don't mean to offend anyone, but it is. Now, White did make a lot of changes to the typical tarot decks when he published Rider-Waite. For example, originally you had a Popus card, based on the legend that there once was a woman who managed to become Pope. She basically dressed in man's clothes, managed to get herself elected Pope, and then blew it when she birthed a child in the middle of a papal procession. I don't know if that story is true or not, nobody knows, but that's the legend, and that was what the card was based on. But Rider-Waite made that card into the Empress, if I'm not completely mistaken, and he made some other changes to the card. So now I'm not trying to diss on the Rider-Waite deck, it's an amazing deck, it's very good for beginners, and the symbolism is very nice, it's very important, it is easy to grasp. And I have a Rider-Waite deck, and I have a lot of decks that are based on the Rider-Waite, and it was an extremely important part of tarot history when that deck was published, but to say it should be the only definition for what a tarot deck is, that doesn't work. So then what should be the definition? Well, I have two definitions. One, and this is the most important one, is that it has to feel like a tarot deck. It has to have the energy of a tarot deck. Now that it might be a bit of a touchy-feely, floaty definition, and yeah, I know it is, but sort of, you can see some decks that are very far out there that still feels like tarot decks. And you have decks that have the typical 78 cards, they have the typical names for the cards, but the symbolism is so strange that it doesn't feel like tarot. If you get what I mean. So to me, if I'm handed a 90 card deck that just have a lot of the same symbolism, that just feel like a tarot deck, I'm much more inclined to say this is a tarot deck and accept that claim that it's a tarot deck than if I'm handed a 78 card deck that just doesn't have the energy about it. My second definition is that it should have most of the traditional symbolism intact. Now, I don't necessarily mean that Rider-Waite symbolism, but if you look at the history of tarot, you have some indications how the cards generally are made, the symbolism that you will generally find in the cards. Now, like I said, not all of the cards used today were used originally, and various regions of Italy had, and I think also it was in Germany they became quite popular. Anyway, various regions of the world where the tarot were developed had different cards, but after a while you do see a pattern emerging, and a deck should follow that pattern. Now, they can do small changes by all means, like for example a lot of novelty decks changes the names of the suites in the little arcana, so to fit the theme of what they are trying to make, and I have no problem with that. Not unless basically I have no problem with it as long as it still keeps with the symbolism of the elemental correspondences with the main ideas behind the suites. So if they want to call, like I have the Maged Ascension Tarot, and they have of course done the whole dynamism and stasis and all of that for the suites. And if you play Maged Ascension, you will get what I mean. And I think that works very nicely because they still have the symbolism. Symbolism more important than name here. But, and the same with the major arcana cards, they can add a few, they can take a few away, they can change them around a bit, but I should have most of the cards should follow the symbolism. So basically, a deck have to A, feel like a tarot deck. It has to have that feel about it. And I can't really explain that feel, and I guess that that feel might be different between various people, but for me to consider it a tarot deck, it has to have that tarot feeling. Yeah. Secondly, we have that it should have the traditional symbolism. Now, that symbolism might be changed around, it might be adjusted, but the symbolism should be there, and it should be there for most of the cards. If these two definitions or criteria is there, I would consider it a tarot deck, no matter how many cards and how else it has been changed. If of course the creators wants to call it a tarot deck. Now, that brings me to the topic of traditional vs untraditional tarot deck. Because here it's much easier to make the definition. Now, why is this important? It isn't really unless you are following a book, for example, that has very traditional meanings for the tarot decks, then an untraditional tarot, if you look for the tarot cards, then an untraditional tarot deck won't work as well with that book. But most important is if you're doing occult work. For example, if you are using the tarot deck to better understand the Tree of Life, for example, then you can't use an untraditional deck because then the symbolism doesn't match up. So a traditional deck has it's much more rigid. You have to have the typical, I would say from the 1800s, the golden, from early to late Golden Dawn era, that sort of idea of the tarot cards, and have to follow that pretty well. That's a traditional tarot deck. Like for example the Rider Waite or the Hermetic Tarot. These are traditional tarot decks. The Thoth Tarot, for example, is an untraditional deck, and the deck I just reviewed, the Steampunk Tarot, that falls a little bit in between because it has very much of the traditional meanings, but it has switched it around a bit as well. But I would go so far as to call that too a traditional deck because the symbolism is very traditional. So yeah, if you're gonna be using it for um, developing yourself spiritually, tarot magic, divination, then it doesn't really matter if a deck is traditional or not. It only matters whether or not it speaks to you. However, if you're going to be using a deck for traditional ceremonial magic, for work with the Tree of Life and so on, then it becomes much more important that the deck is traditional, or you'll have the square peg round hole problem. But yeah, I can see using the Rider Waite as a template for a traditional deck, not because it defines traditional deck, but because it is a traditional deck. So unless your deck is pretty similar to the Rider Waite deck, I can't consider it traditional. While an untraditional tarot deck can be anything as long as it has most of the symbolism and the feel of it intact. So yeah, that's my take on it. Like I said, I think it's very hard to put a hard and fast "this is it" because the tarot is art, and also it didn't develop in a vacuum. It was, if you look at decks found in one part of Italy and another part of Italy and one found in uh, Germany and so on, you will find completely different decks. So various decks has various sources of inspiration. So it, from the beginning, it didn't have one hard and fast rule here. But generally, you would say that there's a symbolism and some archetypes that goes through it like a red thread, and that thread should be intact. Then it's a tarot deck. And I guess it's that thread too I call the feel of it, the energy of it. So yeah, if it has the red thread of tarot, it's a tarot deck. If it doesn't, it's an oracle card. It's an oracle deck. So yeah, that's my take on the whole what makes something a tarot deck debate. Hope you have enjoyed this video, and blessed be.